Isn't it time you got to know your technology leaders? You're listening to Off the Record with GTRA, and I'm your host, Kelly Oakham. So grab your coffee or cocktail and join us for our casual yet intimate and thought-provoking expose on our top council members, ambassadors, technology innovators, and thought leaders. Thank you for tuning in to today's Off the Record with GTRA. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest, Dave Packer, Vice President of Product Marketing with Druva. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Thanks for having me today.
Great. Well, I'd like to kick things off getting to know a bit more about you personally. You know, you grew up in a very interesting household, so let's start off by telling us a little bit more about your story.
Yeah, I grew up, I'm a California native. I grew up in Southern California. Interesting enough, my dad was actually in the television industry as a television producer. So he used to produce a lot of commercials. And, it was interesting at a really young age, he went to go participate at a college course at Dartmouth College. And when I was there, I got introduced to their computer lab and played around with their PDP-11 at the time as a little kid. And got so fascinated with it, actually, that it kind of kicked off this kind of lifelong journey in the tech industry, which, started off with my dad, because of the business he was in, had to manage a lot of tapes that they used to ship around all the time. And we kind of struck a deal where if he got me my first computer, I'd help him manage his tape library. And we're talking, hundreds of tapes. And what would usually happen is, we wouldn't know who it got shipped to or would never get returned, so we couldn't follow up, or his business couldn't. And, ultimately at the end of the day, it was a business expense that he was trying to manage better. So I created a very small database program at the time because I was, really trying to learn about technology and computers and actually helped them manage the process. And at the same time, I got to get the benefit of kind of learning about technology. So a good win-win for the family and the business at the time.
I love it. Really cool. So how did you end up venturing into Silicon Valley in the tech industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was going through school, I got in this situation where, paying for my way through college was really the best way to do it. And so I went and I got a job at a kind of local computer store and wound up managing it over time, but got into computer sales at that time, selling hardware to businesses in Southern California. And when I graduated from college, I kind of continued on that path of computer sales at the time and came into the Silicon Valley to work for a company called Silicon Graphics, which back in that time in the 90s was, all the, really popular and very well-known hardware business, especially in the 3D graphics area. So got involved in that, specialized in CAD/CAM and computational fluid dynamics and a lot of kind of scientific usage of technology. And it was really fascinating. I enjoyed it, and at the time, there's a lot of things going on in the industry, a lot of, new technologies and things like that. So I moved up here, took advantage of that opportunity, and I've been up here ever since. And it's been a great journey kind of going through all the different facets of the industry and all the changes.
What was your most memorable experience over the years working in Silicon Valley?
Well, I've been fortunate. I've actually worked for a lot of different companies doing different things. Everything from information governance to security to tablets to the scientific computing piece. Probably, from over the years, it's been great and a lot of experiences, but I think the one that really stands out for me is very late in the 90s. I was involved in a computer company that was very small, about 60 people. And we were designing a tablet computer, right? This was before the iPad and everything else came to fruition. And what was interesting about it is we were developing it. We were creating kind of this new, operating system, leveraging some Microsoft technology. And what had happened is during the process of defining the tablet and the reference to hardware designs and the software piece, we started getting in these conversations with Microsoft about APIs. And what ultimately happened is Microsoft got very fascinated with what we were doing, and they actually wound up buying the company. At the time, the company was called Uppercase.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was interesting, and what was great about it, and I think from my career perspective, people are driven by a lot of different things. For me, ultimately, it's kind of seeing kind of those ideas and innovations kind of come to light. And what was great was that year at Comdex, Bill Gates actually took our prototype up on stage and showed it off and announced it as the basis of what was going to become the tablet PC. And so then Microsoft took that and they created the tablets PC and evolved that over the years. But I think for me, just seeing something that I put a lot of time and heart into, with working with our engineering teams and everything else, actually get main stage at something like Comdex in front of thousands and thousands of people. That was one of the real big highlights of the years that have passed by.
Wow, what amazing experience. And I mean, to see that innovation be validated by somebody, I don't know, like Bill Gates is
right.
Got to
exactly.
be pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's like you always want that to happen, that kind of stuff. So it was great to really just kind of see it happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know your involvement in information governance has been important to what drives you. So, can you tell us more about how this became part of your career focus?
Yeah, probably I'm going to say about 12 years back, I went to go work for a company called Interwoven at the time, and I was brought in to really kind of help define and kind of build up their business around kind of legal document management. And it was a company they had acquired at the time called iManage, which is actually in the legal business is a pretty well-known system today. What's interesting, though, is that it was kind of my first foray into kind of information management and governance and kind of understanding kind of the information that people were dealing with on a regular basis as a business. And as I started talking to more kind of corporate enterprises, you became acutely aware of kind of how much just kind of healthcare information, PII type information is kind of flowing around these businesses. And a lot of it is sensitive information, the information that you don't want somebody having as an individual, right? And so if if one of those companies gets breached or whatever, that's a concern. Or if your data gets mishandled, that's a big issue as well. And there's plenty of documented fines and cases out there where companies have had that happen, and we read about it pretty often in the press. But I think about 7 years ago, I actually had all of my identity credentials stolen, which included, social security numbers, parents' names, and everything else. And wound up having a bunch of fraud happen against my accounts. And, I think that just kind of, it was interesting kind of being in the industry and looking at it strictly from a business standpoint to kind of then attaching kind of a personal event to it, kind of really put me more in that seat of like awareness, right? When it happens to other people, you're aware and you're doing something to help. But when it happens to you, you suddenly become more acutely aware. And I think for me, it started becoming a real focus of my career, and I got more involved in understanding compliance requirements and regulations and how that plays into how people manage and handle data. And also being in technology, I can take kind of all those years of experience and kind of that childhood passion of innovating and say, what can we do to kind of make it easier for businesses to do the business they need to do, but without putting data at risk at the end of the day?
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't agree more. I have a similar experience with going through an identity theft situation myself, and it takes years to recover. And a lot of people don't realize that. They think it's from something that a misstep that you may have made, but they don't realize how frequent this happens. And not only that, but it can happen in an instant and devastate your life for years to come.
Right.
And, the thing is that, how can you need to make sure you give critical people, like your director of finance, your personal information or sensitive information so they can actually do their job. But how do you ensure that, the information that you're actually giving to people is enough to do their job, but then they're not going to be compromising your information?
Right. Well, and it's interesting that you say that and that you had that happen, because if you look at a lot of the breach incidents, something like 60 to 70% of them are actually internally caused, like, somebody sending an email to the wrong person or the wrong files, or just, those files are easily accessible, or, unfortunately, it's still a large percentage. I sometimes make it analogous to, when there's shoplifting. If you look at shoplifting, the largest percentage of shoplifters are actually employees. And, there's a recent, just last year, a case with AT&T where they were fined by the FCC $25 million because internal folks were misappropriating information of customers. It's unfortunate, and I think that's one of the challenges businesses face today is how do you handle this information, but also keep a watchful eye on it without overstepping your boundaries and without impacting people's day-to-day lives.
Yeah. Well, and it does come down to also people, process, technology. I have another interesting, story where I was helping my father with his company. It's just it's a camping product, but they deal with a merchant processor, First Data, and they were hugely successful, did a great marketing campaign, and tons of sales coming in. So the merchant processor said, "We're going to put a hold on your account so that we can verify all these transactions. So what we need you to do is we need you to email us a spreadsheet of all of your customers' personal information, including their credit card numbers, their billing address." And I looked at him and I just said, "You realize that they're asking you to email everything that somebody needs,
right,
so all these customers' information." I said, "Who's the person asking for it?" "Oh, it just happens to be the head of the risk department." So I think it just goes to show that clearly somebody's trying to do their job and prevent risk. So not to get too off topic, but I know you've had a lifelong technology journey, interwoven with experience in mobile, cloud, security, and information governance. How has it all come full circle for you?
Well, I think, it's interesting. We're at a point in the industry, at the time, as I was moving from company to company, my fascination's always been on technology, especially new technology. So I've always kind of jumped onto, hey, that's really interesting what this company's doing. I want to be part of it, be part of the definition of kind of what's going on. And I think, it's funny, as you go through life, you kind of all these very kind of disparate things that you do, right, as you move along, all in the same maybe industry along some similar vector. But in technology especially, there's a lot of kind of hopping from one to the next or what have you. And at the time, it's like, I was involved in mobile early. I was involved in compute early. I was involved in kind of security and in governance at a time. And e-discovery I've had a lot of involvement in, and as well as compliance. And, they're all somewhat related, but at the time, I think, they were all kind of seen as different kind of technology directions in the business. What's fascinating about it now is that I look back and I think, wow, everything I'm doing today is actually an amalgamation of all those things. And everything that I, bring to the company I work for now, Druva, is, my experience in security, my experience in compliance and information governance, and all in mobile devices, right? So it's all kind of come together in a way that it really kind of lends to my background in all these different areas I've been involved with, which has been great. It's really a definition of, when they say, like, you go on a journey and, the adventure is the path, on the direction to the end point. But, the thing of going there and then getting to where I am today, it kind of like makes sense, right? It kind of clicks for you. You kind of go, wow, all those things I did that all seemed like they were different directions at the time really kind of come together to be where I am now, which has been great.
And shape who you are, and very well-rounded and interesting and unique, to say the least. What is the most important priority for you today at Druva?
My main focus is to really kind of help customers make sense of a lot of the current issues that they face in their business. I think, many of them are facing a very complex data landscape. Probably the biggest thing we've seen change in the last few years really been the front on compliance and regulations. We continue to see evolution in what's happening in Europe and, Singapore, China, et cetera, where, the DPA or, the Data Protection Acts have become much more stringent. There has been some attempt to kind of weave them together and kind of have like a general Data Protection Act in the EU, which is the new, what they call GDPR. And we've also had, some challenges with Safe Harbor, right? That was recently struck down. There's a new kind of replacement of that called Privacy Shield that's currently going through the ratification process. Maybe in a few months we'll actually see that come to light. But really, there's all these issues that companies are now facing about the exchange of data and how do we protect this information that's PHI, PII, PCI type information. But on top of that is the kind of the growing challenge of just data becoming more dispersed. We have mobile devices now. Everybody in a business is a mobile worker. If somebody loses their mobile device, there's a high potential that there's data on there that could be compromised. And when we see kind of the rules becoming stricter, but data is becoming harder to manage for a business. And, just because it's harder to manage doesn't mean that business gets a hall pass if data gets compromised. Companies are really facing a sticky set of issues. And then you kind of add the complexity of cloud services on top of that. You can start seeing a landscape where companies are really kind of scratching their head and saying, okay, we know kind of going certain directions is good for our business. It increases productivity. It makes us, more agile, more competitive ultimately. But at the same time, I've got to contend with all these kind of dynamics that are changing in my business, and how do I kind of take those on? And so a lot of, my focus, especially here at Druva, which is, a business that really focuses on kind of helping companies manage information governance across all these kind of disparate areas, is, how do I help customers understand, what those issues are? Because a lot of them aren't fully have full perspective on them. And the other is how do you kind of navigate through that? It's not all Druva's technology to help you do that. Sometimes there's other technologies that are essential to also accomplishing that goal. But, what we find, it's probably even for me, which has been interesting in the last few years, is we have large enterprises that call us and say, we need to do something in Russia, or we need to do something in China or Singapore. What have other customers you've worked with done to address kind of their data issues? Because, I have employees there, their data, we need to make sure we're doing the right thing with, but at the same time, we have to exchange data between all of our offices internationally, and there's all these little nuances that make it very complex. So, in some of it's very contradictory at the end of the day. In Russia, the laws are a little bit different than in the EU, but the reasons they're different are entirely, opposing to each other, right? One is for protecting privacy to the utmost and making sure nobody has access to that data. And the other one is ensuring that the government has access to that data, but that data is still protected from a privacy perspective. So a lot of complexities there. And, I'll add into that real quick is, we look at even just the, Apple iPhone issue, recently here in California. There's all these things that start, unwinding if we change, right? On one hand, if we allow for data access, we're also saying we're compromising privacy. If we compromise privacy, that ultimately people are very U.S.-centric focused on that particular issue, but it creates a bigger international issue for us. And because, those devices go all over the world, that creates issues, and it actually has the potential to have impact to the Privacy Shield in the EU. So there's all these like little subtle things that are happening that people need to be aware of and how they manage data. So that's a lot of my focus here at Druva.
Excellent. Well, let's shift now to talk about the state of data security. And, nearly every organization of any size in the world is really facing the same challenge of all the data that's moving to mobile devices and cloud services. So how does government and healthcare maintain their obligation to protect sensitive data for compliance and legal process?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think data visibility, especially today, is really at the core of it, right? As I mentioned earlier, a company doesn't get a hall pass on stewardship of data just because suddenly, people are carrying it on their mobile devices, right? And so there's a landscape out there where the kind of that loss of visibility and the loss of that centralized management of it has become kind of a big issue. And I think, one of the things is that we have definitely seen in the last few years is companies traditionally will have, shared drives or a content management system or something in place to try to centralize data that's important and to add manageability to it, whether that's workflows or other types of processes. But because of mobile and because of cloud services and because of some of these other things that are happening in the environment, that centralization has been somewhat eroded in the last 5 years, and companies have become very acutely aware of it. Organizations, have realized that no matter what processes they put in place or what technologies they put in place, there's always this concern about data leaks, right? And if we look at a lot of the penalties and fines that companies can be levied, or organizations can, find themselves in pretty sticky issues, including, court cases, that potential for a leak is always on the top of people's minds, right, and keeping them awake at night. So, do I have to worry about it being compromised? Do I have to worry about it being exposed? That's something that, and I will say, something like the EU GDPR is a great example of, wow, that if somebody loses a laptop and that data is not encrypted, there's a huge penalty a company can face, right? So really kind of getting your head around that data is important. And, another thing that, especially here at Druva, we get involved with a lot is, and this is very, very common in the U.S., is just the whole issue around litigation, right? Companies suing companies, whether that's for IP or it's, some type of in-house litigation. There's a lot of termination lawsuits, things like that happen. When things are mobile, it becomes much more complex to manage data as part of the evidence process, right? And, how do you capture it correctly? How do I make sure that we treat it like it's evidence? And when it's on a mobile device, what happens if that's a remote worker? How do I get that device? How do I get the data off of it? What happens if that person loses their device? What happens if they quit the company? Just the complexities are kind of multiplying and becoming very costly for businesses.
The interns who have worked for GTR, our organization is entirely virtual. And so we actually deal with that as an organization. We provide devices and laptops, and we keep everything on Salesforce and Google, and, and employees are going to access and download what they will without you knowing, and it's right. It's tough, especially when you brought up, the point of, when there's an unfortunate situation where someone, has been terminated, it's pretty difficult, a lot of times, right. They can hold things hostage, so to speak, because they know that you're at their mercy for your data that's sensitive. Right. So we've been through that, and we know it's tough. It can be costly, and it can be pretty damaging. And we're in the business of talking about security and securing your data, and we deal with that every day as an organization. Right.
Yeah, I mean, every company does, right? And you raise a very interesting point, which is, you hate to say it, but people are actually the biggest part of the problem.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of companies face an issue, which I'm sure even you're probably aware of as well, is that when you hire people, whether they're interns or contract employees or full-time employees, you always make them sign a fair use contract for managing information or handling information of the companies. And we all recall it when we first hired. If I mention things like it says you must return that information. It's proprietary of the company. Things like innovations and stuff like that. And there's actually it's been really interesting to see some of the court cases where companies tried to push these fair use contracts, have people sign them, and because they weren't defined clearly or they were overly ambiguous, the company actually couldn't get their data back. because in court they weren't able to show that they could force the contract or enforce it and reclaim the data back. So it's become one of these issues where it's complex because we're highly dependent on people to get the job done at the end of the day, right? People are the number one asset of any company, but at the same time, how do we enable people to conduct business when the velocity of business is very fast and we're dependent on data moving around efficiently, without really impeding on end users, but at the same time making sure that we're not compromising information or losing information at the end of the day.
Well, I personally think one of the biggest problems is that the penalties are on the company and not on the individual employees.
Right,
that we've had people at very senior management levels within our organization walk out the door with an entire 15 years worth of data research, and we have a year's worth of legal battle just to try to protect it. It's like, what's the point now? A year later,
right.
And there's no penalty for those individuals, but as an organization, that obviously we're the ones on the hook for that sensitive data. So
right.
But what do you think the biggest issues government is facing with data privacy?
I think I think it's very similar, right? There's, we can point out the breaches the government's already experienced, but how do you protect individuals' privacy? How do you allow data to move around? When we work with government agencies, there's a lot of the companies we work with or organizations we work with are focused on research, right? So a lot of R&D and sharing research with various labs or various colleges, et cetera, as part of the research process. I always say research is a great example of this. At the same time that you're doing that, there's a lot of data that's flowing back and forth. A lot of it is sensitive information that needs to be, protected and needs to be monitored. And what we find is that, today it's hard to control that, right? We've just talked about all the reasons why, but at the same time, how does a company manage or any government agency manage data moving around and ensuring that it's properly locked down, that it's protected, that it's traceable, auditable, that you can find where the sensitive data is in the environment, which I think is a big one for a lot of companies. I think there's there's this issue of kind of like those kind of hidden time bombs of, somebody has a spreadsheet, right? That's like, as you mentioned earlier, can have a lot of people's PII on it. Mm-hmm. But where is it, right? And who's got copies of it? The unfortunate thing about technology is, it makes things more efficient, but at the same time, there's a lot of replication in the process, right? There's no guarantee that there's one copy. It could be 12 copies, right? And at the same time, you might be using some kind of a file sharing type system, or you might have backup systems in your environment. That data is propagating to those. How do you check to make sure that you're putting the right things in place, that you have the right security posture? And I don't think it's any one solution. Druva, we focus on, getting visibility to those endpoints and those cloud services, right? And providing all the information you need to understand what data is there, what the security posture is, provide some elements around data protection for recoverability, for legal management, compliance, et cetera. But, I think that's one element. We can help you identify like at-rest risks, but there's also just people using email. As you mentioned earlier, mm-hmm. Somebody can send an email with a lot of information in it and not even know that they're sending sensitive information. I have a family member that lives in that works in the medical field, right? Not uncommon for them to send emails around that have, information that's PHI attached. No matter what I say, they still do what they want to do. But that all creates these inherent risks at the end of the day. And I think we look at government agencies. I think they're just as subject to that, right? Which is there is a lot of data flowing around. There's a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of antiquated systems that force people to try other routes to exchange data and or move data from one place to the next. So I think it's an issue that affects everybody. I think what I see with government, especially, is the focus on things like cloud, right, initiatives and things like that. And I've had a lot of conversations with government agencies that really, as part of the Cloud First initiative, really want to go that direction. But there's still, you have to be very cognizant of, if you want to go cloud, who's the data? Where's your data being stored? Is it FedRAMP certified? Does it follow ITAR? All those other things, depending on the requirements of your particular agency. But also that applies to the SaaS vendor as well, right? Just because maybe, for example, Druva, just because we leverage Amazon and Azure doesn't mean we don't have to also do the right things to make sure the data is protected as well, right? Because you're only as protected as each layer of the services, right? And there is a weakest link problem in that model.
Yeah.
So, that's when I think about government agencies, I think the challenge there is there's that push towards, cloud and adopting technologies to become more efficient. But I think there's still a general sense of, okay, well, how do we accomplish that and still protect this data?
Well, and that leads me to my next question. The other big issue with cloud, which has been it's really had a significant impact on your business.
Yes. I mean, cloud is, for us, it's interesting. I think cloud is one of those things where I think if you had bumped into me 4 years ago and asked me about it, I would have been, oh, yeah, it's kind of like this new thing. Maybe it'll go somewhere. And then, when it came to Druva a few years ago, cloud was one of our offerings. We also were offering an on-premise solution at the time. We still offer an on-premise solution, but I'll explain that in just a second. So about 2 years ago, I would say 80% or 85% of our business was actually people buying our product for on-premise, right, and managing their mobile workforce and devices and everything else, and providing kind of data recovery capabilities. Today, if I look at our business, 95% of it is actually all cloud. And that's including a bunch of organizations using our GovCloud capabilities, which is the isolated Amazon region specifically for government agencies and contractors. But if I also, kind of the surprising thing, and this was when I first started seeing this trend, I scratched my head a lot because I was like, this doesn't really make sense. But if I go over Druva's top 10 or 20 customers that are using the cloud, they're all pharmaceutical, medical, government contractors, other businesses that deal with sensitive data on a regular basis, right, or exchange it. And that really at first kind of baffled me, because you would think that organizations that have all these regulations and et cetera are probably the laggards in adopting cloud, and it would be your retailers and general merchandising companies that would adopt it first, or mid-sized businesses. And what we found is actually we did an inquiry with our customers, and we found that the reason that these more regulated businesses were adopting cloud is because when they sat down with their much larger investments in security and teams and infosec people, staffs, and et cetera, what they discovered was that for them, they actually realized that being in the cloud was actually a safer bet than being on premise. For them, that standing up the same data centers, providing the same data durability, the same security monitoring, protecting those data centers, and all the other things that need to fall into place to really be to create a highly secure data center just wasn't feasible, especially as they were expanding their businesses across geographies, right? So you expand out of the U.S. and you go into all these other areas, suddenly the bottom line to my business, which isn't to build secure data centers, has gone up significantly because I'm trying to keep up with the Joneses. And the truth is security is evolving so quickly right now, and what needs to happen, that what they find is that an organization like Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services, that's really their lifeblood, right? If Amazon has a security issue, that ultimately has significant revenue impact to Amazon. So they have to invest much heavier in security and security monitoring and building out the proper data center security posture. So what we found is that was really the reason we were seeing that adoption so aggressively by those businesses. And recently there was actually probably maybe 3 or 4 months ago, a report by one of the leading analysts, and off the top of my head, I can't remember who published it, but that it stated that they were seeing 3 times faster adoption by these kind of regulated businesses versus the lesser regulated businesses. So just kind of really validating that is a true trend that we've been seeing.
Well, it's definitely important. I'm glad that you're working on it and helping secure the data that government and healthcare truly need. And
right.
I'd love to know more about what your ideas and visions are for working with GTRA's federal CIOs and chief security officers.
Yeah, well, I think, I think it's a lot of what we've talked about. I think there's a lot of elements that are coming together. You talk about kind of the cloud first initiative of the government. You talk about all the elements around cloud and mobile, and then you have to, unfortunately intermix that with all the, requirements and regulations, and compliance needs that NIST has outlined. ITAR, FedRAMP, FIPS, all those elements, and also think about the transaction of data that's going on, the growth of international offices and data moving there. From our perspective, what we see is that ultimately, at the end of the day, agencies are trying to make the decision of how to get there, right? What steps they need to take. And what we find is that, from agency to agency, there's different requirements and needs, for protecting their data and, what areas they need to expand into. And I think, from our perspective, the more that we have the ability to interact with those folks to understand those kind of very unique needs, that it helps us a ton, because that allows us to kind of go back and say, okay, this is a very unique requirement. How do we enable that to make sure that this particular agency can store their data in GovCloud that meets the proper FIPS requirements, FedRAMP, ITAR, et cetera, but at the same time allows them to have this mobile workforce where they're going to be maybe storing research data or other types of information that's sensitive. Maybe that information needs to stay within the United States. If somebody takes their laptop overseas, you don't want them to have access to particular types of information. So it's building in those types of parameters and restrictions. But I think, for us as a company, what's really pertinent is making sure that we're not impeding on end users at the end of the day, right? And this goes back to kind of the original statement, is that kind of, I'd say, the weakest link in security is end users at the end of the day. But, as soon as you start building technology that impedes on an end user's workflow, end users start trying to figure out ways to work around it, right? So interacting, with these leaders and being able to have these types of conversations and really try to understand the nuance of how they're trying to manage data, within their agencies, just really gives us a lot of insights of how to better serve their needs with the product that we're building.
Well, good. One of the things we hear often is how government really likes to collaborate with industry to really educate them on what their needs are. So it's good to hear, you're going to be doing that in a productive way. And I know that we've gotten some extremely good feedback from some of the past meetings that Druva has run with the council. So looking forward to more. What are the pressing issues GTRA's federal leaders should address? And, more importantly, what can we do to move the industry forward?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is rooted in kind of the elements we've been talking about. I think there's there's a lot of regulation changes that are happening. There's a lot of changes in compliance requirements, both government driven, but also just industry driven, right? And there's also the international spin, which I always add in because we are very much now as a country, as a set of industries, et cetera, very much internationally tied. There's a lot of data movement that has to happen. But, more conversations around that and the issues around data privacy, especially since that's the one that's really at the head of the curve right now. Government agencies conducting business in international offices while still contending with kind of the EU challenges around safe harbor and data privacy, et cetera. There are questions then of what does it mean to exchange data back and forth, right? Is it employees? Are those employees U.S. nationals? Are they not U.S. nationals? What impact does that have, right? Breaking that apart a little bit better to understand that, we have a lot of customers actually that do business in Germany, and Germany has very strict data protection requirements, including, you have to have a DPO officer, there's a works council, so any product has to go and get approved. It's those types of things that, on one hand, you might be, having all this productivity because you're using a certain technology stack, but then you have an office in Germany. So how do you manage that, right? Does that break what you're trying to accomplish at the end of the day? So those types of conversations just make it easier for businesses and technology providers to better serve kind of those kind of more complex issues that aren't always about adding a feature to a product, but a lot of times it's about understanding it so that you can build in the proper workflows, you can build in the right ethical walls into technology and things like that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dave. This has been incredibly insightful, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you. Yeah,
same here. I really appreciate it. It was really enjoyed the conversation, and it's definitely something that's top of mind for me all the time.
Excellent. Well, for more information on Druva Solutions, go to druva.com. Thanks again, Dave.
Sure thing. Have a great day.
Thank you again for tuning in. Please join us for our next council meeting and upcoming podcasts. Go to gtra.org. Again, I'm your host, Kelly Yoakum, and I look forward to your topic ideas, feedback, and suggested podcast participants. So please feel free to reach out to me at kelly@gtra.org.